The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead as laughter echoed through the private room of Sky Heights Country Club. It was just another Friday night for James Sterling, who sat at the poker table surrounded by 5 other billionaires. Smoke from expensive cigars swirled around them, while empty glasses of aged whiskey cluttered the table alongside chips worth millions. James ran his fingers through his dark hair, studying his cards with slightly unfocused eyes. At 42, he had everything money could buy: a tech empire worth billions, houses in 12 countries, and a collection of cars that would make any enthusiast jealous. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the whiskey, or maybe it was the growing emptiness he'd been feeling lately. "Fold," muttered Richard Chen, throwing his cards down. He was James's biggest rival in both business and their social circle, always trying to one-up each other. Their competition had started back in college and had only grown fiercer with time. "What's wrong, James?" Richard smirked, noticing James's distraction, thinking about another failed relationship. "How many girlfriends have you gone through this year?" 4, 5. The other men chuckled, their faces flushed from drinking. James felt a flash of annoyance. His recent breakup with a famous model had been all over the gossip sites. "At least I can get dates," James shut back, making the others laugh harder. "When was the last time you managed to keep someone interested for more than 2 weeks?" Richard's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, his expensive suit crinkling slightly. "That's because I have standards. Unlike you, who'll date anyone who looks good on magazine covers." "I could marry anyone I want and make it work," James declared, the whiskey making him bolder. "I'm not picky like you." "Anyone?" Richard raised an eyebrow, seeing an opportunity. "Care to put money on that?" The room suddenly got quieter. The other men sensed something interesting brewing. Peter Wong, a real estate mogul, put down his cigar to watch more closely. "What kind of bet are we talking about?" James asked, his competitive spirit firing up. Richard pretended to think for a moment, though the gleam in his eyes suggested he'd been planning this. "Marry someone completely outside our circle. Someone who'd make all these stuffy country club members clutch their pearls. And stay married for a full year." "How much?" James didn't hesitate. $1 billion, Richard said smoothly. "Enough to make it interesting." Someone whistled. Another man muttered, "This is getting good." James should have felt the warning bells going off in his head. But the combination of whiskey, wounded pride, and the challenging looks from his peers pushed him forward. "You know what?" James stood up, swaying slightly. "I'll make it even better. I'll marry a black woman from a working-class background." He spread his arms wide, nearly knocking over his drink. "Someone who's never even heard of this country club. Someone who shops at regular stores and takes the bus." The room erupted in shocked laughter and exclamations. Richard's eyes glittered with triumph. "Now this I have to see. The great James Sterling, slumming it for a year." "Write it up," James demanded, pulling out his phone. "Right now. We'll get the lawyers to make it official tomorrow." Peter, ever the voice of reason, tried to intervene. "James, you're drunk. Maybe we should." "No," James cut him off. "I'm doing this. 1 year of marriage to prove I can make any relationship work. $1 billion says I succeed." Richard pulled out his own phone, already typing. "Terms. You have 6 months to find someone and get married. Then you stay married for 1 full year. No prenup allowed. That would make it too easy. And she can't know about the bet." "Done," James said firmly, though somewhere in the back of his mind, a tiny sober voice was screaming at him to stop. The next morning, James would wake up with a pounding headache and the sinking realization of what he'd agreed to. But by then, the contracts would be drawn up, the wheels already in motion. His pride wouldn't let him back out, especially after the news had spread through their exclusive social circle. What started as a drunken bet was about to change his life in ways he could never imagine. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere in the city, a woman named Amara Washington was going about her day, completely unaware that she was about to become part of a billionaire's risky game, a game that would eventually transform both their lives. As James stumbled into his penthouse that night, he looked out over the city lights and started mentally planning how to find a suitable candidate for his scheme. In his privileged, sheltered mind, it was just another business deal, another challenge to conquer. He had no idea that this bet would force him to confront his own prejudices and reshape his entire worldview. The city twinkled below, holding countless stories and possibilities. Tomorrow, the search would begin. But for now, James fell into his expensive sheets, still too drunk to realize that he'd just made a bet that would cost him far more than $1 billion. It would cost him everything he thought he knew about love, life, and himself. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful poker night, and James Sterling was getting frustrated. His usual methods of meeting people, exclusive clubs, charity galas, high-end restaurants, weren't working. The women he encountered in those places were exactly the type he was supposed to avoid for this bet. He sat in his office on the 50th floor, absently scrolling through his phone while his assistant, Linda, rattled off his daily schedule. "And don't forget about the medical center opening this afternoon," Linda reminded him. "The press will be there." "Medical center?" James looked up, frowning. Linda sighed. "The one your foundation funded in the east side of the city? Dr. Washington has been running it for the past month. You're supposed to do the official ribbon cutting today." James vaguely remembered signing off on the project months ago. It was one of many charitable ventures his PR team had recommended. He usually sent someone else to these events, but something made him pause today. "What time is it?" he asked. 3 o'clock. "Should I send David to represent you instead?" "No," James said, straightening his tie. "I'll go." The east side of the city was a world away from James's usual haunts. His silver Bentley stood out like a sore thumb as he pulled up to the modest building. A small crowd had gathered: local residents, medical staff, and a few reporters from local papers. That's when he saw her. Dr. Amara Washington stood at the center of a group of elderly residents, listening intently to their concerns. She wore simple scrubs under her white coat, her natural hair pulled back neatly, and no makeup. But there was something about her that made James stop in his tracks. Maybe it was the way she smiled, warm and genuine, reaching her eyes in a way the society smiles he was used to never did. Or maybe it was how she spoke to each person like they were the most important person in the world at that moment. "Mr. Sterling?" A young nurse approached him. "Dr. Washington will be with you shortly. She's just finishing up with some patients." James nodded, finding himself content to wait, something that never happened. He watched as Amara knelt down to speak to a child, demonstrating how to use an inhaler with infinite patience. Finally, she approached him, extending her hand. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for coming. Though I have to admit, I'm surprised to see you here in person." Her handshake was firm, professional. Up close, he noticed her eyes were a striking amber color, sharp with intelligence. "Please, call me James," he said, turning on his usual charm. "I like to check on my investments personally." Something flickered in her eyes. Disapproval? "These aren't investments, Mr. Sterling. These are people's lives. This clinic will serve over 1,000 families who previously had no access to proper medical care." James felt oddly chastised. "I didn't mean." "The ribbon cutting is this way." She cut him off politely but firmly. "We have patients waiting to be seen, so we'll try to keep this brief." Throughout the ceremony, James found his attention drawn to Amara. She spoke passionately about the clinic's mission, thanking the community for their support. Not once did she mention his foundation's contribution, even though it had funded the entire project. After the photos and brief interviews, James watched her immediately return to work, efficiently directing staff and greeting patients. This wasn't the kind of woman who would be impressed by his usual tactics of expensive gifts and fancy restaurants. "Dr. Washington," he called out as she headed back inside. "Would you join me for coffee? I'd love to hear more about the clinic's needs." She paused, studying him with those penetrating eyes. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate the offer, but I have patients waiting. If you're genuinely interested in the clinic's needs, you can schedule a meeting through proper channels." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving James standing there, feeling oddly off balance. For the first time in years, someone had looked right past his wealth and seen, what exactly? As he drove back to his office, he couldn't get Dr. Washington out of his mind. She was exactly what he needed for the bet, accomplished enough to move in his circles when necessary, but completely removed from his world of privilege. Yet somehow, the bet had become secondary to his genuine curiosity about her. That evening, instead of his usual social engagements, James found himself researching Dr. Washington's work. She had graduated top of her class from medical school, turned down lucrative hospital positions to work in community healthcare, and published several papers on improving medical access in underserved areas. "Linda," he called his assistant, "find out when Dr. Washington takes her lunch break, and get me everything you can about running free medical clinics." He had a feeling his usual playbook wouldn't work here. For the first time in his life, James Sterling would have to earn someone's attention. What he didn't realize was that in trying to win this bet, he was about to get a priceless education in what really matters in life. As he stared out his office window at the city lights, James thought about Amara's words about investments and people's lives. Something had shifted inside him today, though he wasn't ready to admit it yet. The game he was playing suddenly felt different, more complicated, and somehow more important than any billion-dollar bet. Over the next few weeks, James tried everything he could think of to get closer to Amara. He sent expensive flower arrangements to the clinic, only to find them redistributed to brighten up patient rooms. He attempted to deliver a catered lunch for the staff from a five-star restaurant, but Amara politely declined, explaining they already had a local woman who provided affordable, healthy meals for the workers. Frustrated but intrigued, James found himself spending more time at the clinic, watching how Amara worked. She treated everyone with the same respect, from the janitor to the senior doctors. Her laugh was genuine, her concern for others real, and her dedication unwavering. One rainy Tuesday morning, James arrived at the clinic earlier than usual, carrying just a simple cup of coffee from the local shop around the corner, the same place he'd seen Amara get her morning drink. "Black coffee, 2 sugars," he said, holding it out to her as she rushed past. "I noticed that's your usual order." Amara paused, surprised. It was the first time he brought something so ordinary instead of grand gestures. "Thank you," she said, accepting the cup. "But what are you doing here at 7 a.m.? "I thought maybe I could help," James said, feeling strangely nervous. "I mean actually help, not just write checks." Amara studied him for a long moment. "Can you file papers?" That's how James Sterling, tech billionaire, found himself spending his morning organizing patient files in a tiny back office. His Italian suit got dusty, his perfectly styled hair fell out of place, and somehow he didn't mind at all. "Why are you really here?" Amara asked during a brief lunch break. They sat in her small office, eating sandwiches from the deli next door. "No offense, but men like you don't usually spend their time filing paperwork in free clinics." James looked at her, thinking about the bet that had brought him here. The guilt twisted in his stomach, but something else was growing stronger, a genuine desire to understand her world. "Maybe I'm tired of being men like me," he said honestly. "Everything in my world is about money and status. But here it's about something real." Amara's expression softened slightly. "You're right about that, but it's not easy work. It's long hours, constant challenges, and never enough resources." "Teach me," James said impulsively. "I want to understand." And so began a new routine. James started coming to the clinic 3 times a week, learning every aspect of its operation. He filed papers, helped elderly patients from their cars, and even learned to take basic vital signs. His expensive suits were replaced by casual clothes, his sleek Bentley often parked next to Amara's practical Honda. The staff, initially wary of him, began to warm up as they saw his genuine effort. Mrs. Chen, the elderly receptionist, started bringing him homemade dumplings. Tony, the maintenance man, taught him how to fix the temperamental air conditioning unit. But the real change was happening in his heart. James saw how Amara fought for every patient, making endless phone calls to insurance companies, finding creative ways to get medication for those who couldn't afford it. He witnessed the daily struggles of people working multiple jobs just to make ends meet, yet still finding time to care for sick family members. One evening, after a particularly challenging day where they'd helped a single mother get urgent care for her sick child, Amara found James sitting alone in the break room. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, sitting beside him. "I've been thinking about my life," he said slowly. "All these years I thought success meant making more money, closing bigger deals. But watching you today, that was real success. You actually made a difference in someone's life. Amara touched his hand gently. You helped make that difference too. That coffee run you did in the middle of our crisis, it kept us going. The way you entertained her other kids while we treated the sick one. That mattered. James looked at their hands, his pale skin against her darker tone. He thought about how his friends at the country club would react to this moment, and for the first time, he didn't care. Would you have dinner with me? He asked quietly. Not at some fancy restaurant. Maybe that little place around the corner where you get lunch sometimes. Amara smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. I'd like that. Their first real date was at a small family-owned restaurant. James listened as Amara talked about her dreams for the clinic, her family, and her journey to becoming a doctor. He found himself sharing things too, real things, not the polished stories he usually told at social events. As they walked back to their cars, James realized something that terrified him. The bet that had brought him here no longer mattered. He was falling for Amara, truly falling for her, and the thought of her discovering the truth about why he'd first come to the clinic filled him with dread. But for now, under the city streetlights, he pushed that worry aside and focused on the way she smiled at him, real and warm and full of possibilities. The man who had made that drunken bet at the country club was disappearing, replaced by someone who was learning what really mattered in life. The proposal happened on a regular Tuesday evening at the clinic. James hadn't planned it that way. He had an elaborate proposal arranged for the weekend involving a private jet and a beach in the Maldives. But watching Amara comfort a young patient after a difficult diagnosis, the words just tumbled out. "Marry me," he said softly when they were alone in her office later. Amara looked up from her paperwork, surprised. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, kneeling beside her desk chair. "I love how you give everyone a chance to be heard. I love how you fight for what's right. I love how you've shown me a whole new way of seeing the world. I love you." The ring in his pocket was forgotten as Amara pulled him into a kiss. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes." News of their engagement spread like wildfire through both their worlds. At the clinic, there was genuine joy. Mrs. Chen cried happy tears and immediately started planning the food. Tony offered to transform the community hall for the reception. But in James's world, the reactions were different. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from his society friends, many thinly veiling their disapproval with fake congratulations. Richard, his betting rival, sent a short text. Tick-tock. 6 months down, 18 to go. The wedding planning revealed the growing clash between their worlds. Amara wanted a meaningful celebration that included her clinic family. James's social circle expected an extravagant show of wealth. They compromised by having 2 celebrations, an intimate ceremony in Amara's community, followed by a grand reception at the Sky Heights Country Club. The morning of the wedding, James stood in the community hall, watching Amara's family and friends transform the simple space with twinkling lights and flowers from local gardens. Her grandmother, Mama Rose, approached him. "You're worried," she said, her wise eyes seeing right through him. "I want everything to be perfect for her," James admitted. Mama Rose patted his hand. "Perfect isn't about fancy things. Perfect is about love being real." Something in her tone made James wonder if she knew more than she was saying. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. Amara wore a dress she'd found at a local boutique, altered by her aunt who owned a tailoring shop. She carried a bouquet of flowers grown in the clinic's community garden. James had never seen anything more beautiful. Their first kiss as husband and wife was accompanied by cheers and the sound of gospel music from the local church choir. Mrs. Chen's homemade dumplings sat next to traditional soul food on the buffet table. Children from the clinic, where Amara had treated their scraped knees and winter colds, scattered rose petals. But the evening reception at Sky Heights Country Club was a different story. James watched as his wealthy friends made barely concealed snide remarks about the quaint afternoon ceremony. He noticed how they formed tight clusters, barely mingling with Amara's family and friends. Richard cornered him at the bar. "Interesting choice of venue for the first ceremony," he smirked. "Slumming it a bit, weren't you?" James felt anger rise in his throat. That ceremony was more real than anything that's ever happened in this building. "Maybe," Richard shrugged, "but remember our deal. 1 year of marriage starting tonight. Clock's ticking." Before James could respond, he felt a warm hand slip into his. Amara stood there, radiant in her second dress of the day. "Everything okay?" she asked, looking between them. "Just congratulating the happy couple," Richard said smoothly, raising his glass before walking away. James watched his wife greeting guests, moving effortlessly between both worlds. She treated everyone with the same warmth and respect, whether they were clinic patients or billionaire CEOs. Some of his society friends were visibly surprised by her intelligence and poise, their prejudices cracking slightly. Later that night, as they swayed to their first dance, James held Amara close. The guilt of the bet weighed heavily on him, but his love for her was real. More real than anything he'd ever known. "What are you thinking about?" Amara asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "About how lucky I am," he said truthfully. "About how you've changed my whole world." As the evening wound down, James watched Amara's grandmother observing everything with those knowing eyes. Mama Rose caught his gaze and gave him a long look that seemed to say, "Don't mess this up, boy." Back in their hotel suite, Amara fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's events. James stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there was the clinic where he'd first met her, the place where he'd learned what really mattered in life. The bet that had started this journey now felt like a dark cloud on his horizon. He loved Amara with everything he had, but their marriage had begun with a lie. As he watched his wife sleeping peacefully, James made a silent promise to spend every day making sure their love became bigger than the bet that had brought them together. 6 months into their marriage, James's life had changed in ways he never expected. The massive penthouse he once lived in now felt cold and empty compared to the warmth of the modest house they'd bought in Amara's community. His mornings, once filled with business calls and stock reports, now started with breakfast at the local diner where everyone knew their names. But it wasn't all easy. Living with Amara opened his eyes to things he'd been blind to before, like the time they went shopping at an upscale store and he noticed how the security guard followed them, or when they attended a charity gala and his business associates spoke to Amara slowly as if surprised she could understand complex medical terms despite her being a doctor. "It happens all the time," Amara had said quietly on their drive home. "You're just noticing it now because you're part of my world." That night, James couldn't sleep. He sat in their kitchen, thinking about all the times he'd been part of the problem without realizing it. How many times had he made assumptions about people based on their appearance or background? The next day at his office during a board meeting, one of his directors made a casual racist comment. Before his marriage, James might have let it slide. Now, he stopped the meeting cold. "We don't talk like that here," he said firmly. "Not anymore. If anyone has a problem with that, there's the door." The boardroom fell silent. Later, his assistant Linda told him several employees had tears in their eyes. "We've been waiting for someone to say that for years," she said. At home, Amara was proud but not surprised. "You've always had a good heart," she said, stirring a pot of her grandmother's recipe for soup. "You just needed to wake it up." Their weekends developed a rhythm. Saturday mornings were spent at the clinic, where James had become a regular volunteer. He knew every patient by name now, celebrated their victories, and grieved their losses. Sunday afternoons were often spent at Mama Rose's house, where James learned to play spades with Amara's uncles and helped in the garden. One Sunday, as James helped Mama Rose plant new roses, she said something that stuck with him. "You know what's funny about flowers? They don't care what color the hands are that plant them. They just need love and attention to grow." James looked at his dirt-covered hands next to hers, thinking about how much his view of the world had changed. "I wish everyone could understand that," he said. "They will," Mama Rose replied. "One person at a time, one day at a time." Back in his corporate world, James began making real changes. He started a scholarship program for underserved communities, but instead of just throwing money at it, he worked with Amara to understand what students really needed. They provided mentoring, internships, and support systems. His old friend Peter visited his office one day, surprised to find James personally interviewing candidates for the scholarship program. "What happened to you?" Peter asked, half joking. "The James I knew would have delegated this to HR." James looked at the stack of applications on his desk, dreams and hopes put to paper. The James you knew didn't understand what mattered. The transformation wasn't just in his actions. His whole worldview was shifting. He found himself questioning things he'd taken for granted before. Why were all his board members from the same background? Why did his company's health insurance not cover the treatments many of his employees' families needed? One evening, as they walked through their neighborhood after dinner, Amara squeezed his hand. "You're quiet tonight." "I was thinking about how much I've learned since meeting you," James said. "About how much I still need to learn." They stopped to chat with Mr. Washington, an elderly neighbor tending his garden. 6 months ago, James would have hurried past, maybe thrown some money at whatever problem the old man had. Now, he spent 20 minutes discussing the best way to grow tomatoes. Later that night, as they lay in bed, James watched Amara sleeping. The bet that had brought them together now felt like a distant nightmare. He'd started this journey thinking he was doing her a favor, playing at being part of her world. Instead, she had given him the greatest gift of all. She had opened his eyes to real love, real community, and real purpose. But Richard's words still echoed in his mind, clocks ticking. 6 more months until the bet's deadline. 6 more months until the truth would have to come out. The thought made his stomach churn. Because now, looking at his sleeping wife, James knew he'd rather lose every penny he had than lose her. The $1 billion from the bet meant nothing compared to the wealth of love and understanding he'd found in Amara's world. As he drifted off to sleep, James made a decision. Tomorrow, he would start looking for a way to tell Amara the truth. He just hoped that the love they'd built was strong enough to survive it. 2 weeks before their 1-year anniversary, James had everything planned. He would tell Amara the truth himself, explain how a drunken bet had led him to the greatest love of his life, and beg for forgiveness. He'd even prepared to sign over half his fortune to her medical initiatives, whether she forgave him or not. But Richard had other plans. It started as a normal day at the clinic. Amara was seeing patients while James helped with paperwork in the front office. The morning sun streamed through the windows, and Mrs. Chen's fresh flowers brightened up the reception area. Then Richard walked in. James saw him from across the room and felt his heart stop. Richard wore his usual expensive suit, looking completely out of place among the clinic's regular patients. "Dr. Washington," Richard called out as Amara passed through. "Do you have a moment? There's something you should know about your husband." James jumped up, but he was too far away. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as Richard pulled out his phone and showed Amara a video, footage from that fateful poker night, recorded by someone at the table. The color drained from Amara's face as she watched. James could hear his own drunken voice through the phone speaker. "I'll marry a black woman from a working-class background. Someone who's never even heard of this country club." The waiting room fell silent. Mrs. Chen stood frozen behind her desk. Tony, who'd been fixing a light fixture, stopped mid-task. Everyone watched as Amara's hands began to shake. "Amara," James started, moving toward her. She held up a hand to stop him. "Is this real?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, but—" "A bet?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Our whole marriage was because of a bet." Richard smiled smugly. "$1 billion bet, to be precise. James here had to marry someone from, well, your background, and stay married for a year. Quite a performance, wasn't it?" "Get out," Amara said to Richard, her voice deadly calm. "Get out of my clinic." Richard shrugged, dropping a manila envelope on the counter. "Just thought you should know the truth before your anniversary. The contract's in there, if you're curious." He walked out, leaving devastation in his wake. James tried again. "Amara, please, let me explain. Yes, it started as a bet, but—" "But what?" She turned on him, finally letting her anger show. "But you fell in love for real? But you changed? But you're sorry?" She picked up the envelope, her hands still shaking. "How much am I worth, James?" $1 billion? "You're worth everything to me," he pleaded. "The bet doesn't matter anymore." "I was going to tell you." "When?" She cut him off. "After you won? After you proved to your rich friends that you could civilize someone like me." The waiting room was still silent, everyone watching their world fall apart. Mama Rose, who'd come to bring Amara lunch, stood in the doorway, her wise eyes filled with sadness. "All those times you helped at the clinic," Amara continued, her voice breaking. "All those Sunday dinners with my family. All those nights we talked about changing the world together. Was any of it real?" "All of it was real," James said desperately. You changed me, Amara. You showed me what really matters in life. The bet brought me to you, but love made me stay. Love. Amara laughed bitterly. Love doesn't start with a lie this big. She looked around the clinic, at the walls they'd painted together, the children's artwork they'd hung up, the community they'd built. You know what hurts the most? I actually thought you were different. I thought you saw me, really saw me, for who I am. I do see you, James whispered. No, she shook her head. You saw a way to win a bet, a project, a chance to prove something to your friends. She took off her wedding ring and placed it on the counter. I'm not your project, James, and I'm not your bet. She turned to Mrs. Chen. Cancel my appointments for the rest of the week. I need some time. Before James could say another word, Amara walked out of the clinic. Mama Rose followed her, but not before giving James a look that held more disappointment than anger. James stood in the silent waiting room, feeling his world crumble. Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes. Tony shook his head sadly. These people had become his family too, and he betrayed all of them. He picked up Amara's ring from the counter, the metal still warm from her hand. A year ago, he'd thought this marriage would cost him $1 billion. Now he realized it might cost him something far more precious, the only real love he ever known. As he walked out of the clinic, he heard whispers behind him. The story would spread through the community by nightfall. The rich man who married their beloved doctor for a bet. The outsider who'd pretended to be one of them. But James didn't care about the gossip or the bet or the $1 billion. All he could think about was the look in Amara's eyes when she realized their whole relationship had started with a lie. 3 months passed. Autumn turned to winter, and James hadn't seen Amara since that devastating day at the clinic. She'd moved in with her grandmother, filed for divorce, and thrown herself into her work. The clinic continued without him, though he made sure all the funding remained in place through a blind trust. James spent those months soul-searching. He sold his penthouse and moved into a small apartment. He stepped down as CEO of his company, appointing a diverse board to take his place. The $1 billion bet. He'd already transferred it to a foundation dedicated to providing medical care in underserved communities. But none of it filled the hole in his heart. One cold December morning, he sat in his car outside Mama Rose's house, gathering courage. He'd been coming here every Sunday for weeks, not to see Amara, but to tend the rose garden he'd helped plant. It was his way of staying connected to the family he'd lost. This time, Mama Rose was waiting for him. About time you showed up, she said, sitting on the porch swing despite the cold. I've been here every Sunday, James said quietly, kneeling by the dormant rose bushes. No, she shook her head. You've been hiding. There's a difference. James looked at his dirty hands. I don't know how to fix this. Mama Rose patted the swing beside her. When James sat down, she said, Tell me the truth. Not about the bet, about your heart. I love her, James said simply. More than anything. The bet, it feels like something from another lifetime. Like it happened to a different person. Because it did, Mama Rose nodded. The man who made that bet isn't you anymore. But the question is, what are you going to do about it? That evening, James walked into the clinic during community hours. The waiting room fell silent. Mrs. Chen dropped her pen. Tony stopped mopping the floor. Amara stood at the reception desk, frozen. She looked tired but beautiful, her white coat slightly wrinkled from a long day of caring for others. What are you doing here? She asked. Being brave, James replied. Like you taught me. He walked to the center of the waiting room and faced everyone. A year ago, I made a terrible bet. I thought I could play with people's lives and hearts like they were just pieces in a game. I was wrong. I came to this clinic thinking I was above everyone here. Instead, you showed me what real wealth looks like. He turned to Mrs. Chen. It looks like bringing food to someone who's hungry. To Tony, like fixing things that are broken. To the patients in the waiting room, like supporting each other through hard times. Finally, he looked at Amara, and it looks like loving someone enough to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Amara's expression remained guarded. Pretty words won't fix this, James. I know, he nodded. That's why I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to show you what I've learned. He pulled out a thick folder. I've signed over controlling interest in my company to a community trust. The board is now made up of people from neighborhoods like this one, people who understand what's really needed. The $1 billion from the bet? It's already being used to build 10 new clinics like this one. Why? Amara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Because you taught me that real change isn't about grand gestures or winning bets. It's about doing the right thing day after day, even when no one's watching. He placed the folder on the counter. I'm not asking you to take me back. I'm just asking you to believe that the love I found here was real, more real than anything in my old life. The waiting room was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes. Tony leaned on his mop, nodding slowly. Amara picked up the folder, her hands steady now. You did all this. It's not enough, James said. It'll never be enough to make up for how this started. But it's a beginning. She studied him for a long moment. And what happens now? Now? James smiled sadly. Now I keep doing the work. Keep showing up. Keep trying to be the man you helped me become, whether you're in my life or not. As he turned to leave, Amara's voice stopped him. James? He looked back. The community garden needs weeding, she said softly. Tomorrow morning. Early. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a chance. A small crack in the wall between them. A possibility. The next morning, as the sun rose over the clinic's community garden, James arrived with work gloves and a thermos of coffee. Amara was already there, kneeling in the dirt. They worked in silence, pulling weeds, preparing the soil for spring. As the morning wore on, other people joined them. Mrs. Chen brought her famous dumplings. Tony came with his tools to fix the garden fence. Mama Rose arrived with seedlings for next season's vegetables. Slowly together, they began to rebuild not just the garden, but trust, community, and maybe, just maybe, love. Because sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. Like a billionaire on his knees in a community garden, learning that the richest things in life can't be bought with any amount of money.